Okay, before I delve into the video discussing some further thoughts on the AFL's drug policy and the current drug scandal that's engulfing the AFL, I want to say to everyone, Happy Easter. I hope everyone had a happy Easter. And also, I'm still a little bit under the weather. I do apologise if my voice isn't as clear and I'm, a bit snotty. But I'm still not 100%. I've caught yet another chesty head cold. Not as bad as the last one, but it's annoying when you're getting over one virus and then you get hit with another one within a week. It's horrible. But it's that time of year. The weather's starting to change. It's still very damp. And there's a lot of cold and flu viruses around. I mean, scarlet fever. That's another one. Whooping cough. There's a few of these things around. And they just knocked me for six. Anyway, excuse me. Let's delve into the AFL ongoing drug scandal. Now, I did a video towards the end of last week, a few days after the scandal broke, and I don't think I did it justice. Honestly, I think I got my point across, but there's a few other areas I want to specifically look at. Now, the AFL drugs policy itself, it's been in place since 2005, amended I think 2015, 2016, so it used to be a 3-strike policy, now it's a 2-strike policy. And as someone who doesn't watch the AFL as regularly as I used to, and I will admit that, when the drugs policy was last updated, when I was watching the AFL pretty religiously in about 2015, 2016, 2017, I was watching it far more regularly, watching a lot more games than I do now. I watch the occasional game now. Circumstances have changed. I'm a bit older, I'm in full-time work now rather than just doing random little contract jobs. I live by myself, so I've got to manage an apartment by myself. And so, yeah, my circumstances have changed. I have less time. I can't watch as much sport as I used to. And, of course, the channel isn't self-sufficient. Now, if the channel was to become self-sufficient, I would probably watch more AFL games and more AFL content. That being said, let's talk about the policy itself. The policy is brought in 2005. It's updated in the mid-2010s. About 2015, it's updated. 2016, it's updated. Now, of course, at the time, the West Coast Eagles, there was a lot of rumours circulating about the West Coast Eagles and Ben Cousins in particular. We know about Ben Cousins' drug and alcohol problems and his legal issues off the field. And, of course, one of his former teammates did die in 2007 as well. Very well documented, a lot of rumours circulating about drug and alcohol misuse with the West Coast Eagles. As a reactionary response, the AFL brings in the illicit drugs policy. Now, I was just watching another YouTube channel, which is a Carlton fan channel, and they did a video a few days ago. I think it's Blues Abroad, I think it's called. And I left a comment on their channel saying, well, here's a thought. Certain countries around the world have started to decriminalise and legalise certain recreational illicit drugs. So I use the examples of Uruguay and Germany in the last few years. Uruguay has now decriminalised all drug use. Cocaine is now legal in small amounts on your person in Uruguay. You will not get charged, you will not lose your job, you will not fail a drug test or anything like that if you have personal use. Germany has literally in the last 48 hours legalised cannabis. So when this story broke midway through last week, Germany was in the process of passing legislation legalising personal use of cannabis and personal possession of cannabis and personal cultivation, whereby if you have a certain amount on you, you will not get arrested, you will not get a criminal record, you won't get searched, you won't get your personal use confiscated if it's within the thresholds that's allowed. So this now raises further questions. What happens if Australia, down the line, decides to start decriminalising or legalising certain illicit substances? I'm not saying Australia will, but a lot of countries around the world that have a similar political outlook, similar democracy, are deciding to go down this route. And there is a debate about drugs, recreational drugs being decriminalised and legalised. Certain states in the US, for example, like Colorado, quite famously, and California, quite famously decriminalised or legalised cannabis use. So that is a subplot to this. That's something that I didn't cover last week, partly because Germany at that point hadn't actually legalised cannabis. It was going through the processes with the German federal parliament. So that's something that needs to be thrown into the discussion because society has changed since 2005. Back in 2005, yes, Ben Cousins and the West Coast Eagles, there was a lot of discussion around that team and that team's culture and certain players within that team. Ironically, drug use was actually falling at the point the drugs policy was brought in. There was just some high-profile things that were going on in the league at the time. Fast forward to when the drugs policy is updated, drug use has started to climb again. Now, a lot's happened in the last 19 years, the COVID pandemic being one, higher suicide rates, higher rates of mental health problems, especially in young people. And the economy isn't doing as well, so that people are feeling more stressed, worried, and a lot of people are not coping very well with their mental health and the stresses, and they will turn. And when you find that there are downtimes in society, economically or society-wise, drug and alcohol use and gambling use goes up. So there are some correlations here. Studies have shown this. So in the last 19 years, nearly 20 years, society has changed. That's something else that needs to be looked at. Social media wasn't a thing back in 2005. So all these players now getting caught on social media on a night out or on holiday doing something they shouldn't be. That's something that wasn't there 20 years ago. And there's a lot of stories in retrospect that are discussing like the 70s, 80s and 90s of all sports, of player behaviour and the alcohol kind of culture and the lad kind of culture 30, 40, 50 years ago. And how players in that era, from the 70s to the 90s, saying we can't get away with what we used to get away with on a Friday night. Players would rock up on game day on a Saturday and a Sunday completely steamed, completely off their rocker. You can't do that now. So society has changed over the decades and over the years. There is a societal problem with recreational drug use and alcohol use. Depending on where you are in the world and what industry you're in, it ranges from 1 in 5 to 1 in 3 people in a workplace will fail a drink and a drugs test. Depending on the industry and depending on the region or the nation you're in, somewhere in that range would fail a drink and drugs test. A lot of them would fail on alcohol, but a fair proportion would fail on illicit recreationals. It's a fact. And then there's another proportion who would fail on prescription medication that they haven't declared or they're not meant to be taking with the job they're doing because, health and safety. And that's another thing thrown into the mix, not declaring your medications. And that's something else that I didn't cover. There's another company that, I work for a local authority as a contractor. My company's basically the contractor. I deal in the waste disposal, residential waste disposal. We've got another contractor that does the highways and pavements, another contractor that does the public parks and gardens. There's another contractor that does the road sweeping and other aspects of road maintenance. We have several contractors working for the local council where I work. It was the same at my previous council that I worked for, and actually the one before that. Certain councils will delegate or contract out certain aspects. Now, one of the contractors that shares our depot has its drug and alcohol test board and its health and safety board, and it will say how many drugs tests and alcohol tests they've done in this depot and the sister depot on the contract. It will say how many have passed and how many have failed, and it will also compare to the previous lot. And some people have failed the recent drug and alcohol test. Now the numbers are a lot lower than I thought, but I think having that carrot and stick method, whereby the company is saying, look, if you fail a test, you're gone. But we're also going to advertise and show how many tests we're doing, and we're going to make it public, and we're going to do these group batch tests every 6 months. So, since I've been working, which is about 2.5 years, just over 2.5 years, every 6 months they do a batch of tests, and they will do this over all the contracts they do in the region, and then they will compare between certain depots. And the numbers of fails are actually coming down. So their method of the carrot and stick, saying, look, we are going to test, we're going to make the test results public, but not your name, but if you fail, you're gone, seems to actually be having a positive impact. Just using that as an example, but there is still a percentage that fail. I think there was 1 month where there was a double figures of failures. It's now dropped to low single figures. So the numbers are coming down for fails, but there's still a lot of people getting tested and there's still a lot of people failing. But the numbers are coming down for fails, which is a good sign. Now, I also am talking from as I said in the last video, personal experience. I've been through drug and alcohol rehabilitation. And there was a mental health aspect to my drug and alcohol rehabilitation. I've had some relapses, but I have gone through the whole process. And there was a carrot and stick method. We are going to get you help, but if you resist going through the voluntary phase, we'll compulsorily make you do it through, this, that, and this, and we may not give you that. So there was aspects of carrot. We're going to help you, but we may make things a bit more difficult for your life, like court orders, refusing to give you certain benefits, certain aspects to go, here's the help, but here's the this is the stick bit. We can make your life a bit more difficult in order for you to be forced to get help. So there was that. I'm not saying that method always works, but there was a carrot and stick kind of bit of give and take. You had to be willing to go, I need to get the help. And that's the thing. This current drug policy really gives a lot of carrot, not enough stick. Because what has been alleged is that, through this federal MP, Andrew Wilkie, that club doctors would take players to an out-of-league, out-of-WADA facility to do a drugs test after the players self-report. So it's on the players to self-report and be smart enough to go, I've screwed up. And the league's fully aware of this. This is the problem. If the league wasn't aware of this, and this was individual clubs doing this, I think this is a different type of scandal. But the league is fully aware of this aspect of, we're taking players out of the testing pool. We're going to test them ourselves. They're going to report themselves. Self-regulation doesn't work, by the way. Just putting that in there. And if they come back clean, they're allowed to continue. If they come back with enough trace in there, we're going to go, right, okay, we're going to say you've got a stomach bug, a flu virus, you pulled your groin, you've tweaked your knee, you've got a sore shoulder. They'll come up with an excuse, take them out of training, put them on the injured reserve list, and then they're not part of that testing pool of players on match day. Basically, protecting the player, protecting the league's image. And this is the perception, is the league is protecting itself. Is it really helping the player by saying, right, okay, you failed. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you a 6-8 week rehabilitation program, 3-month program, maybe an ongoing program. You're still allowed to play and train, but you're going to be suspended from games for a few weeks. We won't publicly release that you're suspended, but we'll blag it's still there. There's no put the player into rehabilitation behind closed doors. That doesn't seem to have been taking place. And then, so that doesn't seem to have been happening. And then there is okay, now the player's going to get outed in the media. Down the line. Now, only one player hit the 3 strikes. There was police involvement. We know a couple of players have hit the 2nd strike. And where they've actually failed in some way, shape or form, without necessarily the league assisting them in taking them to this off-site facility in the Heidelberg area of Melbourne. But there does seem to be more of the league trying to protect its image. Now, this is not curing the problem. This is just moving the problem around. The problem is, players are still on let's say, through the police or on a night out, still getting caught in possession of or using. But because they haven't failed a test, they're not really getting banned. They might get a couple of games suspension by their club and fined by the club. Maybe a suspension from the league, something like that. Internally disciplined by their club or fined by the league. We know that 2 Sydney Swan AFLW players, as I said in the previous video, have been caught in possession of drugs. They got fines. We know that a male Sydney Swans player has been caught. He got an internal disciplinary suspension, I believe, or suspension from the league for a few weeks. But because they didn't fail tests, they're not on the banned list. So, and this is not just an AFL issue. We've seen this in the NRL. We've seen it in the Super League, in rugby league. We've seen it in club association football. We've seen it in the North American leagues. And I've done videos on various players who failed tests or, being suspended because of drug use or drug possession. And I've discussed it at length on live streaming and videos. Now, as I say, I haven't been keeping up to date with all the AFL news. It was only because this appeared on NRL 360 last week that the AFL was in this drug scandal that I decided to start doing some research, because I'm more of an NRL fan. And I was a bit like, what's going on? Why are the NRL looking at an AFL issue? And then I started looking into it, and I was like, Jesus Christ. Now, I wasn't aware until the scandal that the NRL doesn't have a drug misuse policy. It should, but it doesn't. So the AFL is a bit unique in having this illicit drugs policy, but it's a flawed policy that was made up or structured in a reaction to what was happening at a club that was high profile, which was the West Coast Eagles. There was a lot of high profile incidents. So it was a reactionary policy that, while seen as a good idea at the time, was very, very flawed. They didn't update it for over a decade. And so they tweak it slightly, nearly about 9 years ago, 8-9 years ago, and they haven't really regularly reviewed it as much as I think they should. And it's now come to a head with allegations that the league was fully aware and actually complicit in helping players avoid the testers. And this is the damning thing, is they're getting federal money. Now, when the league decided to start up this policy, they did need the federal money a hell of a lot more than they did now. The league did not have as much money in real terms as it does now. The league is $1 billion industry now. Back then, it was still quite a wealthy league, but it did need some money for infrastructure projects. They got a lot of new stadium upgrades and new stadiums built since 2005. Marvel, for example, being one. So they had to agree to ASADA and WADA, which is now the Sports Integrity Australia, which is ASADA. Of course, since this drug policy has been in place, we've had the peptide scandal as well. And of course, Ben Cousins was deregistered 2 years after the drugs policy was in place. He never actually failed a drugs test. He got re-registered a few years after the policy was brought in. After he was deregistered, he played a couple more seasons at Richmond. He then subsequently retired. He's had subsequent further issues outside of the game. Which then raises another point. Post-playing welfare. Because they're not helping players by putting them into a rehabilitation program, whilst, yes, they're self-reporting, and that's great, there needs to be a rehabilitation program running in parallel with these players self-reporting. You can keep it behind closed doors, and you can keep it a little bit cloak and dagger secret, but if they're going to take the issue seriously, get the players that are struggling into rehabilitation programs. Honestly, there doesn't seem to be that parrot working in parallel where the players can still continue to play and train and earn a living and contribute to the game whilst also getting help. That's something that does strike me. I mean, in day-to-day society, people go to rehab and still continue to have their day jobs or studies. They don't have to necessarily discuss that with their employer, and their employer doesn't necessarily have to know, but they are still basically allowed to go to work, go to college, go to university, whatever it may be, whilst going through rehabilitation. That's how rehabilitation is meant to work. It's not meant to take you out of a part of society, because that doesn't actually help, then it stigmatises. So from what I can gather, there's no rehabilitation policy. And I use Ben Cousins as an example. It's a very striking example, is he wasn't actually really, he was more punished than supported. And this is, I think, is another flaw in the drugs policy, the illicit drugs policy, is there's no rehabilitation system. So I can see a lot of ex-players, and maybe even current players, that have benefited from not failing a test with WADA, coming down the line and actually taking the AFL to court, saying, well, where was the rehabilitation policy? Where was the support needed when I was struggling with mental health and addiction? You helped us cover up the fact that we were using drugs, but you weren't helping us get off the drugs necessarily. You weren't helping us with rehabilitation and rehabilitation programs and community programs. You have thrown us to the wolves. I can see ex-players taking the AFL to court over player welfare issues, and I wouldn't disagree or I wouldn't have a negative word to say about that. I'll be fully supporting those players. Honestly, it's the same with any league. Any league, I would say, or any sport, they're very quick to ban the individual and say, "Oh, this player's been caught gambling or using drugs, drink driving, whatever the offence may be. We're going to ban them for alcohol or recreational drug use or gambling problems, but we're not going to help rehabilitate them. We're just going to ban them, and then it's going to be a repeat cycle, whereby." when they retire, they slip back into these issues. I use Paul Gascoigne as an example. His alcohol and drug use was well known. Maradona. They were very well known for their partying lifestyles, and the sport was like, oh, but they're great players. They're entertaining. They entertain the fans. The sport used and abused them. Every sport does it, and a lot of ex-players are saying that the post-playing welfare is not good enough. And I think the AFLPA needs to address this at the next CBA or ongoing negotiations when they are discussing the illicit drugs policy and post-player welfare. We know the concussion issue. There's litigation in a variety of sports over, again, post-player welfare when it comes to injuries, especially concussion, but other injuries as well, and supporting players in regards to operations and medical bills when they retire. The NRL's going through this. They had their CBA negotiations, and post-playing welfare was key in those negotiations. So this is another area that I didn't discuss in the last video. And it's going to be interesting to see how the AFL adjusts their policy. It really is. But it's a flawed policy as it stands, and they're not going to change their policy at least until next season. But they're going to have an announcement at some point in the next few months after they've had meetings with the AFLPA, the club CEOs, and other stakeholders in the game, potentially sponsors and investors in the game. But as the earliest that policy change is going to be implemented is 10 months time. Should they update it as soon as this season, at some point this season? Potentially, yes. I think the policy is flawed and outdated. And as I said at the beginning of the video, society has changed in the last 19 years. Drug use is not, instead of going down, is now going back up. Mental health and depression and reports of people suffering from mental health and depression, instead of going down, again, has gone up. Injury and death rates from attempted and actual suicide are highest in the age group that actually plays AFL and AFLW. So that 18 to 40 demographic. The impacts of mental health and suicide are highest in that age group, and especially amongst men. Although women, it is rising. So the policy needs to reflect what's happening in society to a certain extent, and I don't think it does. But anyway, that's 22 minutes of me rambling about this issue, or adding further to it. Thank you very much for watching. If you get this far, I do appreciate it. Give a like and subscribe. And of course, as I say, for those long-time viewers, you obviously know about my backstory, but for those newer viewers and subscribers, yes, I have had my own battles with alcohol and recreational drugs, and I do speak from experience where I don't think there's enough of the rehabilitation as part of the policy. That's why I think it's a massively flawed policy where they're aware of the problem, but they're not doing anything to not necessarily eradicate, but reduce the issue. They're taking players out of one situation, but they're just sort of prolonging it where they're kicking the can down the road rather than taking the steps as soon as the player self-reports of assisting that individual or individuals through a rehabilitation program, whereby that individual is regularly tested and has to come back with negative results in order to keep playing and training before a suspension. And if they do fail a test in that period, where they've got to be alcohol or drug free, then they go back to square one. They don't come out of rehab. They have to go back to square one in the process, much like what the NFL and NHL does with their drug and alcohol policies, whereby if a player does fail a drugs test or does have a public issue like public intoxication or being caught in possession, where they have to enter a player assistance program, like Pat McAfee and Carey Price have done, and those are the examples I used in the previous video from the NFL and the NHL, that they have to go back to square one in the process. And it's an ongoing process that may take several years. That's the carrot and stick. They have to basically come back clean. And you'll be surprised how many athletes are on the player assistance programs in the various major leagues in North America. It's a lot higher than you think. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of athletes on their player assistance program, and they have to do daily. They have to tell the league, even in the off-season when they're leaving their home state, when they're let's say not training or playing, and they have to tell them when they're travelling on holiday. They have to inform the testing people, the league's testing authority, or the WADA, whoever it is, that I'm going to be in this location, and this is the hotel I'm staying in, this is the family friend I'm staying with, this is who I'm traveling. They have to tell them everything about their lives. And it is a very constrictive policy in the sense of personal freedom, but at the end of it, if you go through all the phases and you're signed off, okay. But there are some carrot and sticks along the way. The league doesn't have that. So that's my views on it. Thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts below, and I'll have some more content for you guys very, very soon.